Hello and welcome everyone to this Clearly Sustainable interview in conjunction with our partners Global Action Plan International. I am your host, Victor Brannigan, and I am speaking with David Gershon, one of the founding members of Global Action Plan over 25 years ago. David is also the co-founder and director of the Empowerment Institute, working on programs with individuals, communities and states to empower change. David speaks to us about the origins of Global Action Plan and the need for change programs to be both replicable and scalable. He outlines how clearly identifying the social value of a change program can help recruit partners that may financially support and promote the program. He also explores the leadership learning journey which change agents must engage with to be successful. David is the author of two best-selling books, The Low Carbon Diet from 2007 and Social Change 2.0, published in 2009. David, thank you for taking this call this afternoon in your busy schedule. You're in New York. I'm here in a radio station looking terribly technical in Kilkenny in Ireland. And so we want to talk first, if we can, back in those pre-internet days when you, as a founder member of Global Action Plan International, can you remember back and tell us a couple of little bits about that starting point?
Surely. Well, it always began with the question, when I became aware that in the industrialized countries, we consumed 80% of the planet's resources, and we were 20% of the world's population. And we wasted 75% of those resources through inefficiency in how we use energy and all the other natural resources, that we were this problem and the solution. And it became clear, given my background, that we had to do and one more thing, a third of those resources that were wasted came out of the individual lifestyle choices we made. And the other two-thirds we were indirectly influencing. So we were the problem, we being our lifestyles, we being people in the industrialized countries. And that was the impetus of creating Global Action Plan for the Earth, which was its original name, in the United States to start with. And then a few years into that, having tested this idea of eco-teams, these behavioral change peer support groups, and a peer support group process based on a program that dealt with 6 topics: solid waste, water, energy, transportation, green, consuming, and empowerment. We built a mechanism that had the potential to be useful in other parts of the world besides the United States. And that was the impetus to reach out to some colleagues that I had, including Marilyn and other people, some people in the Netherlands, a woman named Bessie.
Yep.
To start this idea called Global Action Plan International. And that was the impetus. I think it was starting around 1992 or so. We've been at it a couple of years in the US by then. So that's kind of the story. And then I spun out a second NGO, a nonprofit, and that was called Global Action Plan International. And that was the beginning of that process.
Okay. And of course, running something like that without the benefits of this technology was quite a different world in a lot of ways. Like our own board meeting,
it really was.
Skype meetings and Zoom meetings is how we meet. So
yeah, I mean, there was no real way to do this. It was mostly, I don't even remember the technologies at the time. Lots of physical meetings. I was doing training programs and empowerment in the Netherlands at the time, so we had a lot of meetings there when I was over in Europe. I mean, one still needs to have the physical meetings, but it gets a lot easier to manage now with technology, for sure.
Okay. And empowerment itself, then, I mean, you now have the Empowerment Institute and that whole program. The opportunities and challenges that presents to a community like Global Action Plan, which has now members in 15 different countries. I think we've 20 memberships, organizations. How do you see the opportunities and challenges there?
Around how to manage a global community around this particular theme of empowerment and behavioral change. Is that the question, or is there some other question?
No, it's about how we empower ourselves when we're disparate like this, even with technology.
Yeah. Well, the original impetus, and it's a core part of this whole empowerment framework that we've built in our institute, which has been around now 36 years. So well before the Global Action Plan, it grew out of 11 years prior to that of learning how to empower individuals and how to do behavioral change and small processes. That's where this all began, that knowledge base. But the key that we have always taught people around how you empower someone to go to a place they've never been before is around the power of a compelling vision and then the tools to implement the vision. So the Global Action Plan for the Earth, the original vision, was what I just shared with you. We have this huge impact and we have this huge opportunity if we can organize ourselves and scale it. And so that was the initial vision that pulled people together. It wasn't just the tools, it was the overarching vision of the industrialized countries, the high consuming countries, being able to really tackle the issue of high consumption or wasteful consumption or overconsumption or inefficient consumption. So I think that is still the vision of Global Action Plan. I mean, it may need to be teed up at a more profound level again, or maybe it's clear enough. And I mean, there's a lot of challenges and opportunities in building a global community with a shared purpose, but lots of individual expression on how that purpose is manifest. That was the early challenge of Global Action Plan in the 90s was, how to get a core social technology built and should we say diffused, because it doesn't just happen. If you're about behavioral change, you really have to know what you're doing, because the awareness campaigns at the time were not performing well. They still don't perform. And even behavioral change, if you don't do it well, doesn't really move the dial. And that's only half of it. The other half, which was even more demanding, was how you engage a community in a scalable way. That you have enough people who want to play and know how to engage. So, that's where we then really spun off a lot of experience around block-based eco teams. And that's where we really learned how to develop a script and a whole set of tools that could get anywhere from 25% to 61% of a block engaged in the program consistently by virtue of what we learned. So that was a big learning. And the one we're on now through a new program we've called Cool Block, which includes the sustainability, but also work we've done on resiliency and livability, is to scale this model across cities, which we're doing right now in California, 3 cities in California. So a more demanding exercise when you scale up Cool Blocks to get at least 25% of the blocks in a city participating. And that's our current growing edge, if you will. And so far we're doing pretty well in our pilot. Based on what we've seen, we've got a 55% recruitment rate. We're averaging a 32% reduction in CO2 reduction. We're averaging 25 actions per household, including resiliency and sustainability and livability actions. And we're doing it in lots of different types of neighborhoods, some really demanding ones like in Los Angeles, some more middle to upper middle income like Palo Alto and San Francisco. So, I mean, that's the journey. I'm still on it. Actually, it hasn't changed. It continues to just evolve now with more, shall we say, demand and urgency because of the climate issue.
Okay, and do you, is it all the communications all the time, that responding to the needs and using the social technologies now to try and improve that, or is that a distraction? Do you think sometimes that people find the social distraction or social media is distracting from all of this?
Social media is not really been a major factor. It really is actually a very interesting phenomena. What we found is that the key to our success is the unmet social need of meeting your neighbors. It's the social isolation and the deep pain, unconscious pain that causes when I live on a street and I don't know anybody and I have no ability to feel connected in place. So that has been, it's not been sustainability, it hasn't been climate, it hasn't been any of the social change issues. It's been social isolation and alienation. So we went towards what seemed to be the hardest way to form these teams, which was getting to know your neighbors. Why not just do it with peer support groups that you know? But we found that we met this unmet social need and we were able to leverage it because we now had core drivers that were intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic. And we did not have to appeal to anger or fear or guilt or do-goodism. We could appeal to meeting this human need of social connection with the people who live next to me.
Yeah, yeah, and those connections, of course, they're equal. They're linked. We have an environmental disconnection, and we have a higher self or spiritual disconnection. But the social connection, actually, like that, it's blindingly simple in some ways, and yet hard work at the same stage. Is that right for you?
I would say the key to our work is replicable and scalable scripts that we can teach people, that we rigorously test to see how to get it exactly right. And we train people very precisely and we coach them very carefully. The challenge is that you can't just roll out of bed and do this. You have to know what you're doing. And it's taken us, well, let's see. So we started this in 1991, really 1990. So it's whatever, 36 years, 2000, no, it's 26 years. What is that? 2000 to 2010. Yeah, so 26 years of really pretty rigorous research. I mean, I'm not as active in the Global Action Plan International community as I was in the early days, but I continue to move forward the same agenda that I have been always interested in, which is behavioral change, community engagement at scale, and also building whole system solutions that bring a whole community together. So I'm not just solving a sustainability issue with the civic sector. I'm working with the cities, I'm working with businesses, and I'm working with a more coherent vision of what can happen to a city when it starts to achieve all these results.
Okay, and then as you're working in California and other parts all around the States and perhaps in other countries. So equally, that's a diverse team. And how do you hold that energy for a diverse team such as we have in Global Action Plan International with across 15 different countries?
Well, let's talk about the challenge of building a global community in general is demanding because you have cultural differences. And then you have different levels of acumen and skill. And you need to have a core social innovation to scale. So I wrote a book called Social Change 2.0, A Blueprint for Reinventing the World, a modest aspiration.
Yes,
you can see I've crazy path of believing anything is possible and trying to pull it off. It hasn't changed much since the early days. Mm-hmm. With an audacious name called Global Action Plan for the Earth. So there's a lot of how-to when you build a social innovation that is transformative, that is can move some people or a community or a block to a place that has never been before. And so the key in being able to get a disparate community to really align is a deep insight into the social innovation they're trying to scale. To the extent that it's a loosely formed network with lots of different kinds of activities, it's more of a that approach is more of a network than what I would call a integrated group of people working to scale a very precise social innovation. In the early days, because we were so carefully aligned around the social innovation, when we would meet, it would be about perfecting the skill. As a group gets more diverse and isn't really doing the same things, then it becomes more challenging to find common ground, unless it's a very broad vision or just a kind of a learning community, which is what I think it's evolved into, because you've got a lot of different activities going on, which is just isn't to say that that's not valuable and still doesn't add, isn't needed. It is. It's just harder when you don't have a shared social innovation and social technology platform that you're all trying to perfect together and scale in your own unique cultural ways.
Yeah, I mean, we have had great success and just finished recently around a food action program
Good. That's an example. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have a current one that on water, the Water Explorer program, and these are building our shared skill set, even though they're localized. Then when they go to the different countries,
Well, that's great. That's the idea.
Sure. Okay. And, so what we feel is that, how do we take this now to the next stage and this, build on the success of this, and perhaps mix this problem that we seem to have all the time around funding, where the pot is getting smaller and the application numbers are getting bigger, and so the hoops or the hurdles are getting tighter or higher, and so to try and mix a finance model in some way to that. What do you feel you have learned around how you fund social innovation programs like that? How do they get financed? Do you have points that you'd like to make?
It's a great question. And yeah, I've got different thoughts. I mean, in the early days, the key was working with meeting unmet social needs where there is a funding entity who perceives those needs, and that was cities. We would work with cities and we would help them reduce their solid waste generation or their recycle. I mean, when we got people on the sustainability front, we would eventually figure out how to move, certainly did the foundation route, but that is very demanding and it's not sustainable. You have to have, be a business, and you have to have some value that society absolutely is willing to pay for, or else it's very difficult. And you have to have a value proposition. We had to have a value proposition that was truly bringing value as opposed to social good. I mean, they hopefully are aligned, but there's sometimes nonprofits are doing social good, but society isn't willing to pay for it because it doesn't perceive the need, or some aspect of society, some sector of society. So that's the art form, I would say, of scaling social change at large. Right now, I'm working with a business partner who is part of a larger change process that transcends just this piece of our work, which we call the Cool City Challenge. It's also addressing other parts of my, should we say, Empowerment Institute's larger agenda, which includes development and women's empowerment throughout the developing world, and helping grow the whole knowledge base of social change. So disrupting the process of social change so there's more knowledge available, that book I talked about. And also disrupting social change financing by virtue of being able to build a greater, what you might call social return on investment. I call that second order change, where you can move a system to a higher level of performance and social value. I reference this in my book, this notion of second order versus first order change. The GAP community has the mechanisms, if it can do behavior change at the scale of a city, and then scale across a country, if it can deliver on that consistently based on good research, it has a huge potential, but it's a demanding path. I mean, behavior change is hard. Behavior change at scale is even harder. But if you can crack the code, then funding will not be an issue, in my judgment, because that's the holy grail of social change is behavior change at scale. So, I mean, a lot of easy words to say. It takes time and effort to pull it off. And to the extent that you all are, you know, a social science research community, among others, really studying the whole mechanisms of empowerment and behavioral change and community engagement and block-based or whatever other platforms you want to use, you know, then you're going to become, you know, more capable. It's hard to do that. I mean, I spent the whole decade of the 90s, we spent trying to be a learning community, and we did reasonably well, but it gets harder because people are at every different place in terms of their learning abilities and the nature of their NGOs, and it's hard. It's not easy to do. I mean, I'm so thrilled that Global Action Plan International is still so vibrant and that you're on the board and that there's this amazing regeneration that you've just done to find a new way of holding this whole organization together. I mean, it's just so gratifying for me, really, truly. I honor everyone who's in this community and everyone who's taken leadership over these years.
Well, you know, and we respect that, you know, the first steps are always the hardest steps, and so this is why we're reaching back to people who were there in the early days, and you know, success breeds success, so we're quite excited about this, and the opportunities and the challenges that we have, because as a network, you know, a lot of us are involved with other things as well locally, and Global Action Plan is one of the things that we're doing. However, you know, this module of a sort of a greener living program is still vibrant and used throughout the whole. So, you know, 25 years later, it's still very much part of what we do. On my own board last night in Cork Environmental Forum, we were talking about making approaches to new communities to take this up, because it's so inclusive in how it is done. It's, you know, facilitated learning around this. And I think a lot of people feel that they want to put their shoulder to the wheel, but they're unsure of it because of this disconnection. They don't know where to reach, even in this sea of information that we will now live in. So it is very exciting. For you, what are the exciting programs that you are now involved with, either through the Empowerment Institute or other work that you're doing with the Clinton Foundation or that? Can you tell us a little about the city block one? Perhaps you've mentioned it a couple of times.
Sure. Well, what I began to look at, having spent a lot of time really learning how to do the Green Living program and building a methodology that could get a significant percentage of people living on a block to participate, and of course achieve behavioral change that was sustained over time. We then were approached by the city of Philadelphia, and they asked us if we could work around livability issues, around crime and drugs and the greening of a block and resource sharing and community building and what we would call livability issues. So we applied the same knowledge, and we began to divide a program we called the Livable Neighborhood, build a program. That was also very successful, albeit it was working on the scale of a block level action. And that lasted for a number of years. It ran out of juice because of changing politics, and my own energy to keep working with cities was so, I had to grow out of just that world. It was so hard of a business model. I mean, I could make it work, but it wasn't what I felt was my best use of my life. Along the way, I also got invited by New York City after 9/11 to do one on disaster resiliency. Same idea, you know, the peer support group and the idea of the block scale, or in this case, a building scale, was the platform. Again, also very successful by virtue of the behavioral change and the recruitment numbers. And then after that, I wrote a book in 2006 that kind of culled out a lot of the green living actions into a carbon platform called the low carbon diet. And that book became very successful because Al Gore promoted it after his film, An Inconvenient Truth. He got all these evangelists to get people to want to do something about climate, but they didn't know what to do. So that book took off across 300 cities in 8 countries. But what I found was none of these, even though we were able to get traction, was able to scale. We had learned behavioral change. We had learned how to get the block level. We'd had learned how to get neighborhood scale, but we could never scale to the city. So we were always feeling like we're not there yet. And I identified, I remember having a meeting once with this friend of mine, a guy named Paul Hawken, who'd been tracking us. He's written a book called Drawdown now, and a well-known environmental leader. He said, David, you've been at this a long time. Why have you not scaled? What has not allowed this to scale, fully scale? I mean, you scale at certain levels, and you've been very successful within those constraints. And I began asking the question, what I would call, what are the systems conditions for scaling? Literally scaling across a city, cities across a country, and countries across the world, the original vision of Global Action Plan. So we could actually achieve the numbers and the magnitude of change, the quality of change, and the speed of change that the planet demands. And I started thinking about it, and I began to realize that there were about 5 different system conditions that needed to be in place. And the first one was the right program. And what I discovered was sustainability, livability, or resiliency by themselves, and climate by itself did not have enough universal appeal across the community. And so that was the impetus to create a new program that integrated all of them, which was the cool block. And I'd already mastered the form of the block by then, so I knew how to get a lot of people involved. So one was the right program. The second was the right timing. And by the way, I don't know that we've met all these system conditions. I think I now know what they are, and my next adventure is attempting to meet them, and so far so good. But the right issue, I would call it. With climate and resiliency now so strong, I think we have the right issue if they can be addressed in a more comprehensive way. Okay. There's right timing, which is again part of the opportunity, because now climate change is so profoundly, alive for certainly the early adopter cities that we want to work with. Then there's the right city itself. So we've been looking at where to best do this. We were wanting to be very discerning, so that's why I've chosen the state of California and early adopter cities within the state of California. And then the right leadership, leadership within a city that could really step up, that had the vision, who could play well with us, and so on. So that was the mechanism for the cool block and the cool city challenge. And then I found a partner, a company called Josie Marin Cosmetics. Josie and I have become strategic partners, and she's invested the funding to grow this thing. And she is doing it as part of something called corporate social engagement, which is learning how to do good better, if you will, because most companies do CSR, and they just avoid doing bad things, and they do some philanthropy. But if you could really be a company that made an impact on the planet, that would be a good thing for you in terms of raising their brand profile. So she and I are playing together. And what I'm now doing is I'm bringing money to the table from the city. I'm not asking them for money. I'm saying match the money we bring. Yeah. Because we don't want to waste time with risk-averse cities that are going to just play around the edges. So that's been the process. And we've identified 3 cities that we want to work with. We've been successful so far with, albeit the one that has been most successful is Palo Alto, California. And we've just finished we call our alpha and our beta 1. We're getting ready for the second beta 2. And we've been able to work with about 45 blocks. And I told you on average, we got about a 50-something% recruitment rate on the block, which means of the people that a neighbor knocks on, 55% say, I will join, by virtue of going to a meeting and following the whole process. And getting the kinds of results that I've shared with you, which are quite unheard of in the world of climate change to get these people to reduce their footprint by 32%. So we're on a good path. We've also, our vision is to do this across California and use that as a kind of a country in its own right, because it's got such a good progressive policy, and then scale it across America, and then, you know, around the world. At some point, we may regroup with Global Action Plan as a network around this program if there's interest, and we're in a position, we're not there yet. We really don't want to, what I learned from the first version is don't scale across international boundaries right away. It's too demanding, too complicated. The cultural adaptation process is not where the good energy is, and if good use of energy is. And what ends up happening when you're not really ready, which happened in the early days of Global Action Plan International, was that you pass on a first generation social technology, and then you've already 3 generations above that, but everyone's still using the early social technology, and it's not working as well because you were too early in trying to scale it. So I don't want to be wasting my time telling people, don't do that anymore. Here's our better learning. I'd rather wait until, and it's not just internationally, it's across other cities in California or America. Yeah. So I'm very deliberate. I mean, I learned a lot in the early days on how to scale and diffuse a social innovation. So that's the cool block.
That's a cool block, right? Yeah. In your on your website, you have a little Vimeo video there of, and you speak about leadership and the necessity for the leaders themselves to examine their own behavior in making behavior change happen. And you know, how could you sum that up maybe for us as GAP, as behavior change leaders, how maybe we need to turn the spotlight back on ourselves and have a look and examine our own ways? Maybe that would be a good thing to
Well, I mean, I would say anybody in any leadership position is as good as the quality of their leadership, and one's leadership is as good as their self-knowledge. And to the extent we have unexamined belief systems about who we are and why we do what we do, or what the world is, and how we project onto it our own unresolved issues, we're less effective. So I have always been working on the notion of transformative leadership at 2 levels: learning how to do leadership that is transformative in the world, but also learning how to be able to transform ourselves so that we are a higher performing leader. I think it's a place where social change has a shadow, because a lot of people attracted to social change are very externally oriented and often don't see themselves very clearly. And as a result, have really created constraints in their effectiveness. And I won't limit it to just social change. It's the whole world of NGOs. It's the whole world of business too, for that matter. But NGOs are in the change business. So it behooves us to be more self-aware. And I've developed training programs around that. I have a training program called Changing the Game, the Craft of Transformative Leadership, which is really about working from the inside out and then having more skill, and not just with ourselves, but with the block leaders or the coaches that we bring in, because they're as good as their ability to work through their own limiting beliefs and transform them, for example. And there are no lack of limiting beliefs when you're trying to create, large system change.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, very often leaders, I think, get to the success, and they've learned a lot of skills, and when they get to new sort of situations, the problem is not learning new skills, but unlearning old ones. I think it becomes a real issue.
And Victor, that's one of the things that I have been very drawn to creating my book around, which is the Social Change 2.0 book, which is, this. Well, let me say something about the state of social change. I think it might be helpful as a context, how I see the world from a social change point of view. And it'll have a personal and it'll have a societal aspect. So I see the world through the lens of social change, and I see social change through the lens of social systems. So the world is composed of social systems, education system, healthcare system, political system, economic system. That's how we organize civilization. And those systems are now being asked to perform at higher levels than they have ever had to before, because of technology, because of globalization, because of all the polarities, economic polarities, a variety of things that are causing these systems to not be able to perform well. And as a result, our world is not in a good state. And now what do we do about it? And we have two choices. We can do business as usual change strategies, which were not designed for this kind of change, and get very frustrated. I call that social change 1.0. Right. Or we can start to work at the notion of what I call social change 2.0. So a little bit more about the system dynamic. So when a system is unable to perform against the expectations placed on it, it becomes very stressed. And when it becomes very stressed, it becomes very unstable. And when it becomes unstable, it becomes unmoored from the foundations upon which it is rooted. So it is no longer a stable system, and it starts to perturbate or oscillate or gyrate. And then it breaks down into a dysfunctional system or a marginally functional system. That is the state of our world for the most part. And there are greater or lesser degrees of that breakdown, depending upon different parts of the world. But when it's unmoored, it can also, because it's not held in place tightly, it can also evolve to a higher level of performance and social value. And that's called second order change. Okay. And the book I wrote called Social Change 2.0 is how to do second order change. And the work that I'm describing and the mechanisms of behavioral change at scale, that is the sort of the rudiments of Global Action Plan International, is a second order change strategy, not fully robust at this point for Global Action Plan International, but it's got the mechanism because it's designed to do behavior change at scale. So let me explain then what first order change looks like. And why I created the original, why it wasn't so much that I created, why I was originally attracted to creating this green living eco-team idea and the beginning of the Global Action Plan movement was because I realized that first order change was not going to perform against the demands that a global ecosystem in collapse was demanding of us. So first order change is command and control, passing laws. It is financial incentives, so incentivizing or disincentivizing someone with money, taxation policy, if you will, or various types of incentive programs. If you get X dollars or X pounds or X whatever, to buy a solar array, that's an incentive. The third is, so the first one is forcing someone to change. The second is paying someone to change. The third is awareness campaigns, which is telling people the 50 simple things you can do to save the earth, which is the energy and thinking at the time when the Global Action Plan was initially created. So awareness campaigns or media campaigns. So hoping that if someone knew, they would act. We know that we know lots of things, but we don't act on them. Yeah. And the fourth is protest. So if you can't force someone to change, pay them to change, get them to change by virtue of creating awareness, or protest your way to change, then what's left, as you look at the world, are despair, apathy, or empowering someone to change, getting them to want to change. And getting someone to want to change based, as I said earlier, on a compelling vision and the tools to enact that. And so Global Action Plan is, unbeknownst maybe to itself from a social change point of view, a early stage second order change community. Early stage, and it may not understand fully, it may not be able to see itself. It may see itself being about behavior change, but behavior change is not the end state. It's a piece of a larger change framework because it's not enough to scale. but it's necessary, but not sufficient. So that's the world that I see. And it's not just second order change at the level of systems or within a community. It's also at this level of the individual. So we can do incremental changes, learn a skill set as a leader. But when you're doing fundamental, deep, transformative change as an individual, then you move also in a second order change to a higher level of performance and social value by virtue of your skills and your self-knowledge. And your self-knowledge is not just around leadership. It's also around a spiritual worldview, or what you might call the ability to see things through a unitive lens. Yeah. Most social change leaders tend to see things in a very polarized way. There's an us and them. So wherever they go, they create a ripple. I mean, not a ripple, they create a wake, because they're always creating an us and them in the name of doing good. And that's not to say that's not valuable. And in the ecosystem of social change, you need to fill a lot of the niches, but it's not second order. So it will always fall short.
Okay.
So that's the background on all of my thinking. And I would add, the bigger picture, Victor, that I'm engaged in right now is around how to do second order, how to build a second order change strategy at the scale of the planet. And that's a bigger project we call Reinventing the Planet, which is building second order change capacity on the entire planet, because it is so ready for that. And it has 4 poles. I might as well give you the whole download. The first one is the cool block, or how to keep the planet viable. So trying to be disruptive in the climate action space. The second is how to be disruptive in the development space by virtue of this other project we have called Imagine, which is a women's empowerment initiative, but women's empowerment is the driver of development, but the driver of women's empowerment is agency. And so we've been building this program out across 13 countries, and that's also now getting ready to scale. The third is disrupting social change. So how do you get the process of social change to be more skillful? We call it second order change. And the fourth is disrupting the financing of social change. How do we get money, the billions and billions of dollars that's invested, to get a better social return on investment? In other words, how do you get second order change out of all this change stuff that's going on? So that's the project.
That's the project.
And I'll add one more piece.
Okay.
I'm going to add one more piece. The end state of this is to get people to believe in our future. Because if we don't believe in our future, we can't create it. And you can't get people to believe in our future unless they can see a pathway to create our future. So this is the metaphysics, if you will, of changing.
Well, Christmas is coming. It's about for 4 weeks away. So, that would be a really nice Christmas present for the world, if you could.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It certainly inspires me.
Yeah.
Be busy.
Yeah. And, I really like the idea of this, that there's a quiet revolution like mushrooms happening, and that they'll appear overnight, that we think there's nothing happening on the forest floor, and the next thing, the mushrooms are everywhere. And I think in a way that the social change is a little bit like a mushroom, and that hopefully things will flourish when its time is right. Thank you.
Well, that's certainly a piece of, yeah.
Thank you for that, David. If there was one thing that you'd like to leave us with as what the people could do for making change happen, could you something that at the moment you're very keen on that people would do?
You mean like people in the GAP community, or people at
in the GAP community, sure, and people who are about social change?
Yeah, let me think about that. So I would say one of the most important things is to be a person of hope, and to have a vision that shows you how to create the future so you can feel hopeful. Because if you don't feel hopeful, then what you convey is despair. And many environmentalists convey despair. They're what you might call engaged in the good fight. So in order to be hopeful and then inspire all those people around you, I'll tell you an interesting story, the origin story of Global Action Plan. So I had organized this very large global event called the First Earth Run. We passed the torch of peace around the world in 1986, and it involved tens of millions of people. And through the media, 1 billion people were following this experience, which gave me the belief that anything was possible. And thereafter, I got involved in 1989 with Ted Turner, who was starting this TV show called, I think he was calling it Earth Live or something. And I got involved and learned about the Brundtland Commission's Our Common Future book and became involved in the environmental issue and learned all these things that were the impetus to the Global Action Plan getting started. And I remember going to the UK, and there was an initial person who I had reached out to who knew my work through the First Earth Run a little bit. And I went to speak to a meeting of environmentalists, thinking they would be my natural allies, not really understanding that many environmentalists are actually very much into the us and them mentality, and this was not the kind of thing that would appeal to them. But I didn't know that at the time. And I remember meeting his brother, and I was telling him, you know, look, we can change the world. I mean, we can actually get people to change their behavior. We could actually do this thing. And he had this wonderful look of like, you got to be kidding me. You know, this is not going to happen. This is just too much expectation of humanity. And I appreciate your enthusiasm. I know that I probably got an American thing going on at that same time too, because you know, God bless you. Very naive, perceived as naive, which probably is true relative to, you know, other people's worldview. But nonetheless, I had just done this large thing, so I couldn't be completely written off. But then so basically his worldview was we don't make a difference. And then I met with his niece, my friend's daughter, who was, I think she was like 22, 23. And she said, you know, no way is this going to happen. And I said, well, how is it at 22 you became cynical? I mean, you know, usually you have to be 30. You have to try a few things and fail and then give up on humanity. But 22, you should be more idealistic than that. Mm. How come you, and she didn't quite know what I was talking about, but I said, how is it you came to believe this? And she looked at her uncle and she said, well, this is what I've always been taught. Yeah. So I turned to him and I said, I guess we do make a difference, don't we? So the question really is, what kind of a difference do we choose to make? And we can't be neutral. Either we will perpetuate despair or hope. And we can't be hopeful unless we have something that gives us a foundation for it. So what I would say to the Global Action Plan community is that you are blessed to be on a mission that has huge potential to bring the kind of change that the world needs right now. And it's up to you and all of us to become really, really students of how to do second order change well, because the better you get at it, the better we get at it, the more you'll attract funding, the more you'll attract credibility, and the more we can change the world. So learn, you know, be good students, all of us, and I speak to myself also. I'm always, always, always learning. Probably my greatest gift that I have is that I keep learning and I don't give up. And if you do all those things, I think the world's ready.
The world's ready. David Gershon, thank you very, very much for talking to us today and taking the time. And yeah, let's be the change. So
thank you, Victor.
We'll wrap up with that. That's a great way to end. Thank you very much from behalf of the Global Action Plan community. Okay, super, great. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye bye. Bye. My thanks to David for this really insightful interview, which I hope you have found interesting and useful in whatever change work you are engaged with. You can find out more about Global Action Plan International activities on the website globalactionplan.com, and you can access more interviews and podcasts from Clearly Sustainable on our website clearlysustainable.com.